This is a production of Cornell University.
I'd like to welcome you to the third Einhorn Jewish Faculty Lecture Series. We're very fortunate this evening to have one of the most popular, visible, and prominent professors on campus presenting to us tonight, Professor Ross Brand. Professor Brand is, everyone knows, is the Milton R. Conference Professor of Judeo-Islamic Studies and the Director of Graduate Studies for the Department of Near Eastern Studies. He's written several books. He's a world-renowned scholar. He's also the Dean of the Alice Cook House and a wonderful friend as well. So it's a true pleasure to have Professor Brand speak to us this evening on Moses Maimonides' Loving God with the Mind.
Thank you, Rabbi Ed. It seemed like an appropriate topic for a university. I'm actually teaching a seminar this semester in Near Eastern Studies and Jewish Studies. It's a comparative seminar on two 12th century religious intellectuals, one Jewish, Moses Maimonides, and the other Muslim, Ibn Rushd, known in the Latin West as Averroes. And when I put this into my teaching schedule for the semester, I thought, oh, I really hope I have 5 students. I'll be, less than 5, really very hard, both on the instructor and on the students. And I just lost one last week, but I'm at 18. And I have to say that for those of us who are medievalists, the idea that you would find 18 students at Cornell who would want to immerse themselves in some of the intricacies of the 12th century and comparative religion is an absolute thrill. And on a night that turns out to be the week before most of you seek relief from the rigors of Cornell, this is like on a par with the 19. So thank you very much for coming. Let me frame what I want to say tonight. And the last part of what we're going to do, hopefully we'll do this as a kind of a class. I also have to congratulate all of you, those of you I know and those of you I don't know, because for the life of me, I don't understand why, especially at this point in the year, you would want to have an additional class at Cornell, but more power to you. It redeems my faith in learning and our university. There's a tendency in the United States, really around the world, for those who study the interaction of religious cultures and civilizations in the Middle Ages. But this is especially true, I think, in the framing of Jewish history. And we find it even in the august rooms and halls of the American Academy. And that is to frame the story that is the history of Jewish civilization in the post-biblical period as primarily one whose most important moments, whose most important cultural artifacts, whose most important figures all come from the Ashkenazi world, from Central and Eastern Europe. What's wrong with this view is that for 1,000 years, the overwhelming majority of the Jews in the world, and for the duration they were a very small people and a minority in whatever empire or civilization they lived in. But from the post-biblical and post-Talmudic period, Jews, as a majority of the Jewish population around the world, lived in the lands of Islam, whether this was Ottoman Islam or an Islam that was Arab-oriented in its earliest centuries, or in an expansive Islamic civilization that corresponds to the High Middle Ages. The bulk of the Jews of the world lived for over 1,000 years in the lands of Islam. And this was very much the case with the majority of world Jewry until probably very late in the 12th century, from everything that we can understand. Now, why is this important, and why is it a good introduction to what I want to talk about this evening? It's important because, not just as a sort of side note of demography, or for those who really are oriented towards the civilization of Jews in Eastern Europe or in the modern period in the state of Israel. But what was true for those 1,000 years is that all of the basic, standard, normative, literary, practical, theological, structural values and practices that came to be normative in the post-Talmudic period of Jewish civilization were all either articulated or put in place during this extended period in which the Jews were primarily in conversation with Islamic civilization. Let me give you some examples. There was no systematic study of the grammar of the Hebrew language until Jews living under the orbit of Islam took notice that their fellow Muslim citizens were studying the Arabic language in this fashion. There was no linear, line-by-line exegesis explaining particular words in a line-by-line fashion as a literary form or as a religious practice until the Jews living in the lands of Islam took note that this was in the process of becoming a staple of the Arabo-Islamic literary tradition. There was no, to speak of, Hebrew poetry in the post-biblical period that we could call social poetry, very often called secular poetry. Poetry on themes having to do with life in this world and the interaction between people, very often the sexes. A poetry very much focused on the kinds of pleasures that otherwise totally observant Orthodox Jews could enjoy in God's creation, and at the same time, a renewal and the articulation, the production of a very different type of liturgical poetry. That type of poetry itself was not new under Islam, but a new style in Hebrew liturgical poetry, meaning verse that was meant for recitation in the synagogue service, that placed a lot of emphasis on the individual Jew as a religious unit in their relation with God and so forth, as opposed to an earlier liturgical poetry that placed almost all of its emphasis on the well-being, the life, the suffering, the travails of the Jewish community. In the lands of Islam, and in particular in Iberia, although not only there, Jews began to write a liturgical poetry that addressed those traditional three themes, but also moved on to talk about the religious life of the individual and those particular needs. And those of you that are very familiar with either the daily prayer book or the special prayer books that are used on the high holy days or on the pilgrimage festivals know this very well, because if you look to see who wrote some of those additions to the text, these are all folks from the Middle Ages under the lands of Islam. Similarly, until this particular period, no Jew had ever decided in the post-Talmudic period to create a code of Jewish law that would enable people who could not work their way through the very difficult Aramaic language of the Talmud, whether the Palestinian Talmud or the Babylonian Talmud, or through the really intricate lines of argumentation in either of the Talmudim, that for the Jew who wanted access to God's holy law in a form that they could make use of and could actually study and work with to make sure that they were in full compliance with observance of what God had given to Moses at Mount Sinai as they understood it, that none of this had been put into systematic form for easy access. That began to happen as well for the Jews of Islamic lands, again, as a kind of parallel to law books that Muslims were writing for themselves. Similarly, something that Jews living in observant communities still utilize, and I would say in conservative Judaism and even Reform Judaism today, the idea of difficult questions of observance being forwarded to either individual learned rabbis or groups of learned rabbis for religious guidance on questions that previously had not really been answered, so responsa literature. This has its parallel in the Islamic world as well. It did not exist in Judaism before the Islamic period. The Siddur, I'll start to go a little faster because otherwise this will consume me. The Siddur that everyone takes for granted as basic to Jewish religious life was not standardized until the turn of the 10th century in Baghdad under the orbit of Islam. Various forms of Jewish piety that did not exist before the Islamic period. Piety that resembles Sufi piety, but a specifically Jewish kind of Sufi piety that we see in Abraham Maimonides, Moses Maimonides' son, in 13th century Cairo, are new. And finally, and this will finally get me over to Maimonides himself, what sometimes we call rational theology. Whether you look at the Hebrew Bible, or whether you look at the vast corpus of Talmudic literature, it's very clear that any monotheistic religion, any religion really, whatever its text, whatever the literary form those texts take, clearly have to be about God, and therefore they have theological material in them. But whether we're talking about the Bible, and this is very clear when we talk about the Bible, but it's also very true about Talmudic literature, there is no systematic articulation of what Jews really are supposed to either believe or think about God other than this somewhat vague idea of God's oneness. None of this had been systematized. No one had ever seen fit before the Islamic age to reflect systematically on the theology of the Bible, the theology of the rabbinic age, and to try to sort of take all of that material and rethink it and develop a systematic, organized theology that then could serve both for the elite, some guidance for how very well-educated people could properly think about God in what for them was a new age, and then ultimately, when this was reduced to some basic principles, to create a kind of a Jewish catechism for which none had existed until Moses Maimonides wrote one in the 12th century, which brings me to Maimonides himself. The age in which Maimonides lived was what we like to say was a transitional age, both for Muslims and Jews, but for Christians as well. This was a time in which Christendom and Islamdom were engaged in a mighty historical struggle with important theological overtones for control of the Holy Land. Everyone knows about that. It's called the Crusades. And in the West, this was a period in which the Muslim domain in Iberia was under increasing pressure by the Christian kingdoms of northern Spain to cede territory and to give way to what was then a rising polity of Christian kingdoms at a time when Muslim polities were, I think, dealing with rivalry, with some division, and witnessing kind of the natural ebb and flow of human history in which different civilizations become stronger and others become weaker, and each has to adjust to the new age. So it was a transitional age, and it was an age in which the Jews of Muslim Iberia, Arabic-speaking Jews to the very last person, began to move increasingly and to find both safe haven from dislocation and persecution in Al-Andalus, in Muslim Iberia, and economic opportunity that was being offered to them in the newly expanding Christian kingdoms of northern Iberia that were moving south through the 12th century. Some Jews moved from Iberia to North Africa. Some moved farther east to the Muslim East, preferring to stay in an Arabic-speaking or Islamic environment. Others moved into Christian Spain. This was the period into which Moses Maimonides was born, a very unstable age certainly for this tiny Jewish community in North Africa and in Iberia, but an unstable age for Christians and Muslims as well. And much of what we can say about the theology of the age, I listed before all of these incredible cultural accomplishments of the Jewish community in the centuries leading up to this transitional age, that Maimonides is kind of the most exemplary figure for and of. And he puts the crowning touch on a number of these achievements in a lot of different ways. Maimonides is what we call a contested figure in historiography. Some people think everything that this man, not to sort of move into other religious terrain, but that the guy walked on water. He is the articulator, the most sublime and perfect articulator of a particular variety of Judaism. For some, the most perfect articulator of a universal statement of what it means to be a Jew and what Jews ought to think and what Jews ought to do. For some, if you read about Maimonides in modern Arabic, he's celebrated, for instance, in modern Egypt, in contemporary Egypt, as a kind of Egyptian patriot in a way, someone who spent the last half of his life living in Old Cairo. And so Egypt, even Muslim Egypt today, in a period where other kinds of contests are going on, have staked a claim that Maimonides is one of them. And of course a lot of his works are very well known in the Arabic literary tradition and continue to be read in Arabic. For both Sephardi Jews, and I want to be careful here, Sephardi Jews, when we use this properly in its historical sense, that just means Jews whose ancestors can be traced back to the Iberian Peninsula, either Portugal or Spain, or Al-Andalus, Muslim Spain, and their heirs in the Ottoman Empire, in Amsterdam, in Brazil, in New Amsterdam, in the New World, and points beyond. That's what we mean when historians speak of Sephardi Jews. But for both the body of Sephardi Jews, ever since the time and period of Maimonides, and all of the Jews of Near Eastern lands, whether Moroccan Jews, Tunisian Jews, Egyptian Jews, Yemeni Jews, Baghdadi Jews, Palestinian Jews, Turkish Jews, Jews of Afghanistan, Jews of all of the lands of Islam, along with Sephardi Jews, regard Maimonides as Harav, the most perfect exemplar of rabbinic learning and the person to emulate, probably after the prophet Moses, with whom he shares a first name. Ironically, Maimonides, and those I'm going to go out on a real limb here and guess that a few of you in our group today have had the benefit of a traditional education in an American yeshiva, will know, and you can bear me out or challenge me when we talk about this later, that Maimonides is regarded with a little bit of suspicion in Ashkenazi Judaism. In particular, this began already in the 12th century, and by the 13th century and in the 14th century, many of Maimonides' books were burned, not by Christians, but by Jews in Provence, in northern France, and many were regarded as either bordering on Jewish heresy or as outright heretical in the eastern provinces of Christian Spain, and certainly in Provence and northern France in the 13th and 14th centuries. Some of that distrust, or I would say misunderstanding, or reflection that Jewish culture had undergone other transformations in response to other cultural and historical stimuli in a very different time than the one Maimonides was living and writing in. They had some difficulties with him, and that's reflected in the so-called Maimonidean controversy of the 13th and 14th century when those burnings took place. So that's my introduction. Now, to really get us warmed up about, and if you don't know a lot about him, only know that this was one famous dude and that he's mentioned mostly favorably by St. Thomas Aquinas, a church scholastic. I've already indicated that Muslim authorities, both for his medical research but also for some of his theological work, were well aware of the things that he wrote and studied him, and were often in conversation with him during his lifetime, particularly in Cairo at the end of the 13th century. So this was someone who was extremely highly regarded during the age in which he lived. And it's, except for poetry, and he actually even wrote a poem or two, but except for poetry, he had his hand in almost every area of Jewish life as it was lived in the lands of Islam during this period. And so I want to read something which is an excerpt from a letter that he wrote in 1199 to a Jew actually in Provence who was translating his theological magnum opus written in Arabic, The Guide of the Perplexed. This Jew, Ibn Tibbon, was translating it into Hebrew so as to make it accessible to Jews living in the lands of Christendom who could not deal with the Arabic. So Maimonides, this guy wants to consult him on some finer points of translation. This is not an easy book to read, even if your linguistic skills are terrific with the Arabic in the original. It's still a difficult book. It was written for an elite audience, and there are lots of issues with the way in which it was written and who he wanted to understand and who not. But when this guy, Ibn Tibbon, wrote him a letter from Provence, said, look, I'm having trouble with a couple of passages. You've got to give me an hour of your time or a couple of hours of your time. I'll come to you. And in those days, that was something. Maimonides wrote back, I don't have 5 minutes to give you. I know that what you're doing is important. I'd love it for you to translate this book into a good Hebrew and to make it accessible to others, but let me just give you an idea of what my day and week are like. And this is what he wrote. Now, God knows that in order to write this to you, I've escaped to a secluded spot where people would not think to find me, sometimes leaning for support against the wall. Let's see, in 1199 he was already well into his 70s. Sometimes lying down on account of my excessive weakness, for I have grown old and feeble. With regard to your wish to come here to me, I cannot but say how greatly your visit would delight me, for I truly long to commune with you. Yet, I must advise you not to expose yourself to the perils of the voyage. For beyond seeing me and my doing all I could to honor you, you would not derive any advantage from your visit. Do not expect to be able to confer with me on any scientific subject, for even 1 hour either by day or by night. For the following is my daily occupation. I dwell in Fustat, Old Cairo, and the Sultan resides in Al-Qahira, New Cairo. These two places are 2 Sabbath days' journey, about 1.5 miles, distant from each other. My duties to the Sultan are very heavy. He was a court physician. I am obliged to visit him every day, early in the morning, and when he or any of his children or any of the inmates of his harem are indisposed. I dare not quit Cairo, but must stay during the greater part of the day in the palace. It also frequently happens that 1 or 2 of the royal officers fall sick, and I must attend to their healing. Hence, as a rule, I repair to Cairo very early in the day, and if nothing unusual happens, I do not return to Old Cairo until the afternoon. Then I am almost dying with hunger. I find my antechamber filled with people, both Jews and Gentiles, nobles and common people, judges and bailiffs, friends and foes, a mixed multitude who await the time of my return. I actually like to sort of bottle that, and if I'm ever invited to talk to the next group of pre-med students at Cornell, that's what I'm going to read to them, because he's describing his waiting room of his medical practice when he comes back in the afternoon. I dismount from my animal, wash my hands, go forth to my patients, and entreat them to bear with me while I partake of some slight refreshment, the only meal I take in the 24 hours. Then I attend to my patients, write prescriptions for their various ailments. Patients go in and out until nightfall, and sometimes even, I solemnly assure you, until 2 hours or more in the night. I converse and prescribe for them while lying down from sheer fatigue. And when night falls, I'm so exhausted that I can scarcely speak. In consequence of this, no Jew can have any private interview with me except on the Sabbath. On this day, the whole congregation, or at least the majority of the members, come to me after the morning service, when I instruct them as to their proceedings during the whole week. We study together a little until noon, when they depart. Some of them return and read with me in the afternoon service until evening prayers. In this manner, I spend that day. I have related to you only a part of what you would see if you were to visit me. Now, when you have completed for our brethren the translation you've commenced, I beg that you will come to me, but not with the hope of deriving any advantage from your visit as regards your studies. For my time is, as I have shown you, excessively occupied. This is a busy guy. Even if we say, and he probably wasn't exaggerating by half, if we just sort of list his resume, he was an untitled leader of the Jewish community in Egypt. He was a local and an appellate judge. He was the administrative chief responsible for appointing and supervising community officials, to which he was in constant contact with the Sultan of the Muslim state. He was the overseer of Jewish philanthropic foundations. He was the house physician to the vizier and his court physician, as he describes. He was the most renowned Talmudic authority of his age, East or West, also a scientific medical researcher, and someone with a family. Really quite remarkable. If you think, this is also a really good kind of message to give to Cornell students. If you think you're busy and you have a lot of papers and you have a lot of personal obligations or things that are on your agenda and so on, just remember Maimonides' letter to Ibn Tibbon, and then you'll know that we're not nearly as busy as we like to think that we are. Now, I want you to keep that in mind as we talk about just a couple of basic things without which it's impossible to understand how revolutionary an intellectual, a religious intellectual, this figure was, and how his restructuring of Jewish thinking had a profound and, I would say, lasting effect. In some cases, what we're going to study for the next little bit was rejected outright or misunderstood and compromised. And in other cases, I think you will see that were we able to incarnate Maimonides here, that there would be a lot that he would find lacking in the way in which the three monotheistic traditions still practice monotheism down to our very day. And you'll see what I mean. So here I'm going to refer to the sheet that I passed out. This is an excerpt, just the very, very beginning, the first chapter, and a little snippet from a work that Maimonides completed in 1188. So about approximately 13 years after he and his family moved from Fez in Morocco to Cairo, by which time he was sort of in, well, full adulthood. Today we would call it sort of young, a little bit past young adulthood, but in the full bloom of adulthood. He finished a work that he had embarked on much, much earlier when he was a young man, that in English sometimes is just called Maimonides' Code, or Maimonides' Code of Jewish Law, the Hebrew title that he gave to it, and it's the only work that he wrote in Hebrew. And it's written in Mishnaic Hebrew, and probably is stylistically the most elegant and brilliant use of that register of the Hebrew language that anyone could point to. And the remarkable thing is that it's a code of law. How you make the language in which you deliver a code of law appear to be so clear, elegant, beautiful linguistically is another feat that we can attribute to him. But it's not principally what I want to talk about. This is a monumental code. It's an example of that tradition that I mentioned as one of the things that happened to Jewish life under Islam. The need the perceived need to make access to God's holy law accessible to anyone with even the most basic kind of Hebrew learning. That there were Jewish communities where there were no religious authorities. There were Jewish communities where maybe there was more than one religious authority and they were in disagreement. Maimonides wanted Jewish law to be standardized. He wanted Jews, both living in the lands of Islam and in Christendom, to be observing the same liturgical calendar. There were a whole bunch of calendrical disputes in the Middle Ages when Babylonian Jews and Palestinian Jews disagreed about who had the right to set the calendar, even though they were both going by an astronomical calendar. So there was lots of contention in this tiny minority community. This troubled Maimonides, among many things that troubled him, and he wanted to standardize observance. But incredibly, in this code of Jewish law, which wants to decide for all time and for all Jews the world over what God's holy law requires of them in the way of observance of divine commandments, the do's and don'ts. Before he actually gets to the performative commandments, he prefaces this incredible work of learning, where he has digested not only both Talmuds, but all of the sum of Jewish learning in the post-Talmudic period by his predecessors, the heads of the rabbinical academies in Baghdad and in Palestine of the 8th, 9th, and 10th centuries. He summarizes all of that and decides all matters of law and allows that perhaps he made a few errors and asks people to write in to point out any errors that he might have made. And at the end of his life, as he's reviewing this, he allows that maybe in this entire compendium, he might have made about 7 or 8 errors, which he goes back and corrects. He's not absolutely sure it really amounted to 7, but he's open to the possibility. But he prefaces all of those performative commandments with something altogether unique and profoundly challenging and demanding and difficult. And the first book of the entire code is called the Book of Knowledge. And the first commandment, you could argue, upon which all of the rest, in some sense, rest, is for Maimonides that the believer know God. Not believe in God, but that the believer know God. Maimonides lived in an age, and here the parallel with this individual I'm also teaching about, the Muslim. He was also a jurist and a physician and a theologian and the head Qadi of Cordoba in a part of the 12th century, Ibn Rushd, also requires of Muslims that God, in having given human reason to the believer, to the community of believers, has in effect made a statement that believers must exercise reason as a fundamental requirement of religious life. That's why people have a mind. The mind is not to earn a better living. The mind is, although it may do that, better say that, there's got to be some practical import. I don't know what programs some of you are in. It may well do that, but first and foremost, the intellectual gift that all human beings are endowed with from the Creator is part of the tools that God has given to human beings to better understand God, to know God, in Maimonides' words. Not to believe, but to know. Let's take a look at this, and I'll try to elaborate on that. This is the first chapter, which Maimonides entitles The Laws Concerning the Foundations of the Torah. So he wants to set forth some basic principles upon which all of the rest of his code of law has to have to rest. So he begins the entire work after the preface. The foundation of foundations and the pillar of all disciplines is to know that there is a first existent, that he bestows existence upon all else that exists, and that all existence, heavens, earth, and everything and everything in between exist only by virtue of the reality of his existence. Now, this is a book written, clearly the elite would have access to it. They would have the learning necessary to understand. It's not, it must be said, written for the illiterate or someone who is insufficiently intelligent by their very nature to be able to make heads or tails out of it. But he is writing this, he believes, in such a way as the average person with a basic education should be able to get the gist of it, and that other readers, perhaps better educated, can understand more deeply what it is that he's driving at. He's using a philosophical vocabulary here to restate his understanding of what the traditional belief in one God actually, really, and truly means in Judaism. That's what he's trying to reshape and redefine. Now, in his mind, this is the essence of Judaism. He does not for a moment believe that he's innovating. He couldn't do this if that were the case. He believes completely that what he is going to articulate in terms of what the human being must know, what the Jew must know, is precisely what was given to Moses at Mount Sinai. So it's this notion that notice he does not use a verb here. He won't even call God creator. God is existence itself and truth itself and all itself, upon which everything else owes existence and is completely dependent. This is a different way of formulating the basic notion of believing in one God who is the creator of heaven and earth. Now, why? Why would he formulate it in a different way? It has to do with some of the things that we'll see in a moment. In particular, the problem that vexed, this was not unique to the Jews, but the Jews, I think, had more difficulty with it because they were a small minority and because simply by sort of the historical sort of evolution of monotheism, Israelite religion comes first, the way a historian would look at it, not necessarily people in the monotheistic communities themselves. And the idea is that the language of Scripture, this is also a problem in the Quran, it's even a problem in the New Testament, although a bit less so in both those documents. God is very frequently depicted as having emotions, as having body parts, as engaging in particular kinds of activities, and as having appellations which would linguistically seem to capture God, to freeze God in a particular moment in time, even divine time, in a particular light. In Islamic tradition, these are called the beautiful names of God, of which there are 99 that are known. Judaism has its own version of this, Christianity in a very different way. But it had become very common in the monotheistic traditions, drawing upon the language of scriptures themselves to, in Maimonides' way of thinking, be very free with the ways in which people spoke about God. Maimonides is going to tell his audience here, and this is the entire audience of world Jewry, and he hopes it's going to filter down because he believes everything is at stake, that it is theologically in error, grievous error, if when people either read those words, you can't get rid of the words because it's divine revelation, but when you read those words, if you understand them literally, if you read the anthropomorphic passages of the Hebrew Bible or even of the Talmud, literally, if you believe that God has emotions, that God has body parts, both of which are abundantly referred to, then you are engaged in a most grievous form of idolatry, even if you're observing perfectly the letter of Jewish law enumerated throughout the rest of the code. You've got the most basic thing wrong. And in Maimonidean terms, you are, in effect, engaging in idol worship. You are believing and worshiping a deity that either your imagination or your understanding of a language that was never meant to be taken literally, that you are following that into grievous theological error, the result of which is, and he pulls no punches here, and he believes it's rampant and widespread and it must be cleaned up, is a form of idolatry that most people are completely oblivious of. They believe that by believing in one God, there's no suggestion that they believe in more than one, so they're okay there numerically, but the way they fashion, the way they imagine, what they think about, what happens in their Rorschach test theologically when the God button is pushed, it's all wrong, and he wants to fix it. So, look at number 4. This God that he's talking about is one. He is neither two nor more than two, but a one whose unity is unmatched in its perfection by any other ones that exist in the universe. He is neither one like a species, which subsumes many ones, nor one like a body, divisible into parts, and by the boundaries that circumscribe them, but rather a unity, the like of which nowhere exists. Now, what does he mean here? He means that people have been misled by this business of God's oneness. People have been misled to thinking that this is a quantitative statement, a quantitative idea, the idea that God is one. And of course it is, and he does not dispute that at all. He's not putting forward the idea that there is more than one. But Maimonides is arguing more fully as we go below that the quantitative belief or knowledge in and of itself is only the first step. It's insufficient. The qualitative understanding of what God's oneness really means, insofar as human beings can understand it, is at least as important as the quantitative. And in fact, is deeper, because in his community, he's not dealing with people who say, well, I believe in one God, but I'll hedge my bets. I'll leave open the possibility that there is another. He's not talking to Zoroastrians or to people who follow either Indian or Asian religions. This is not in his domain of experience. So he's talking to a community that has already accepted the quantitative part of the equation, but not the qualitative. And what does the qualitative entail? It means that for him, it means that God's oneness is the very essence of what sets God apart from everything else in existence. Everything else is contingent. Everything else is bound by time and or place. Everything else is bound in philosophical terms by a category that we would call accident. That at one moment you're feeling great, and then the next moment you're feeling crappy. Or at one moment you have hair on your head, and the next moment you're completely bald, or you have vortex baldness, and so on and so forth. That all of existence, not just human existence, but all of existence is variable, mutable, contingent, subject to a whole host of forces and accidents that involve change from one moment to the next. And language captures that. And do not be misled that when God is spoken of after that fashion in Scripture or in Jewish tradition, that it means, when referred to God, the same thing that those words mean when referred either to human beings or to the animal kingdom or to inanimate objects. It cannot mean the same thing. Why? Because language, that language, I hope I've already convinced you, defines and renders contingent a whole category of existence which is always in flux and always dependent. And God is the only entity, an all-encompassing, unfathomable, perfect entity unto itself, that is the only thing in existence that isn't like all of those other things that are variable and contingent and changeable. Now, this is awfully demanding. I mean, I'm putting it in terms that are not purely philosophical, although I'm borrowing a little bit of philosophy, and Maimonides is as well here in this text. I mean, you have to have recourse to certain philosophical concepts in order to make sense of this. But I think you can see, even in the plainest way of explaining this distinction, that there is a radical, you can't even call it a gap, but there is a radical othering between God and everything that is God and everything else, which is dependent upon that first existent or primal cause, which is, for Maimonides, the God of Israel. If the Creator were a body, he would be in 5. If there were multiple gods, they would be physical bodies. For countables of the same existential rank are distinguishable only by virtue of accidents that pertain to bodies. But if the Creator were a body, he would be finite and bounded in magnitude, since there cannot be an infinite body. Now, the power of anything finite and bounded is itself finite and terminable. The power of our God, blessed be his name, because it is infinite and unceasing, since the sphere rotates perpetually, cannot therefore be the power of a body. Because he is not a body, bodily accidents that might differentiate and distinguish him from another being of the same existential rank cannot pertain to him. It is therefore impossible that he be other than one. That one know this is a positive commandment, for it is said, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. That's it for him. This qualitative on top of the quantitative distinction. And only if you know God in this fashion, and you struggle to continue to know God and to think of God in this fashion, he argues, are you free of what, when all is said and done, are idolatrous practices of conceiving one's own God after one's own fashion, with all of the limitations that are imposed upon human beings in spite of the gifts that human beings have been given. Now let's try to wrap this up, and then I'll let you ask some questions. Turn on the other side of the page. If you look, he lays out this question of anthropomorphisms in Halakha number 12. That being the case, all of these and similar things, he goes through a number of very well-known passages in the Hebrew Bible where God is depicted as having feelings or body parts, a face, a back, and so forth. All of these and similar things predicated of God in the Torah and the words of the prophets are figures of speech. And then he gives some more examples. God cannot be sometimes angry and sometimes not angry, because that is a contingency. It's not possible to this thing, this existence unto itself. In chapter 2, this sublime, awesome God we are commanded to love and to fear. And many of you know this biblical proof text. What he does with this in the next section is, and this also I think probably was, well, I know from some discussion that we have from the Middle Ages, must have been incredibly difficult for whole hosts of people out there in the real world. Maimonides lays forth an argument that with this first cause, with this existence in unto itself, I think you can hear in that the conventional notion of a God that needs the universe, that needs people to worship the deity, this too is an illusion in these terms. That God has created the world for God's own mysterious purpose, that maybe some very learned and people with access to particular traditions may have certain secrets that have been handed down about that, but that most people do not comprehend, and in fact, it's dangerous to try to comprehend that. But the conventional view of almost in Martin Buber's terms, of an I-thou between this transcendental utter perfection, which is God, perfection unto itself, which has no need of anything outside itself and which encompasses everything, certainly does not need a creation, and certainly needs and requires no worship. So there's something mysterious going on there, but don't misunderstand it. The corollary to this view of God in the here and now for the average believer is that if people worship God in the expectation of reward or in fear of punishment, they are not worshiping God purely. It's not the same thing as idolatry, but it is not worship in the most proper sense that Maimonides believes is commanded by the Torah. Worship of God is love of God, is seeking knowledge of God and loving God just for its own sake, because that's what's required of human beings. It's what all Revelation teaches them in each of the monotheisms, that if one does it in anticipation of reward or in fear of punishment, he grants that in a kind of social psychological sense that this is one of the grounds in which religion realistically always has operated. This is what most people need. But it's not where you want to get yourself to. What you want to get yourself to is freely giving, freely applying yourself to know the divine and to loving God, not out of fear in the conventional sense, but just out of love without expectation of anything in return. This is the most sublime and the most perfect understanding and performance of what he understands to be those commandments requiring the believer to love God. If one does so for such a venal reason as to avert illness, to acquire wealth, to be able to have healthy offspring, and the like, and even upping the ante to earn a good as opposed to a bad place in the afterlife, you are compromising the purity of the love that God has asked of you. You can just imagine people sitting and saying, oh, is that what he means here? Well, thank you very much. Can someone please give me someone else's book to abide by? I mean, these are very, very demanding teachings, and Maimonides had placed them at the very beginning of this universal code of Jewish law, so that people get the right religion. I think you can see how this would be contentious, and how certainly in later times and places that really did have a different conceptualization of God, this just could not fly. It didn't make sense. It didn't work for some people. I'm thinking in particular of the Jewish mystics in 13th century Spain. This made them very uneasy, because Maimonides' God is a deity so far removed from human beings and so perfect and without a need. Even the very category of need should not be articulated in the same sentence when you're talking about God. That it becomes difficult, if you follow this thinking, to be able to comprehend the mystery of why God actually does bother with human beings, since God has no absolute need to do so, but does so for God's own reasons that involve a whole set of mysteries. And finally, and then I hope you'll have some questions, the bottom of this second page that I gave you, and this is almost a verbatim text to what we hear from his Muslim near contemporary, Ibn Rushd, both born in Cordoba. By the way, you can see statues of each of them today if you go to Spain. I shall accordingly expand some of the major principles concerning the work of the Master of the universe as an entry for persons of understanding. He's telling you here, I'm just giving you a few tidbits to get you going on the right road. Can't possibly put this all into such terse language and expect you to follow it all at once. As an entry for the person of understanding into the love of God. As the sages said on the subject of the love of God, meditate on his works, that you may thereby come to know him who spoke, and the world came into being. That one of the basic requirements of religious life, and this is a little bit different than what I've been talking about, is one cannot know God perfectly by studying the world. But there is an obligation, if you have the capacity and the time and the intellectual inclination, to engage in the study of physics, the study of the universe that we can see and observe in a serious and advanced way. Those of you that tried to get out of the science requirement in arts and sciences, you don't cut the mustard here. You must study physics to the best of your ability. And of course, after physics, metaphysics, the work of the heavens, and astronomy and mathematics, because all of these things, they will not give you a perfect knowledge of God, but in terms of the world, the tangible world, the world of the senses, which is otherwise to be distrusted, these are all avenues of approaching the knowledge of the celestial matters and God. And they offer the intellectual clues and opportunities to begin to get to that kind of knowledge of the divine that Maimonides regards as the absolute human ideal. Some questions. Had you ever heard of any of this before? You've all seen it before, whether you realized it or not, those of you who have ever attended a synagogue service.
So my question is, if one shouldn't have either reward or punishment in mind when praying, then why are there prayers specifically included for
Excellent
things
question.
like the well-being of the community?
There are lots of procedures and rituals and so forth in Judaism that Maimonides regards as things that one must do and say. He's not changing any of that, but that these are sort of intermediate steps that are aids, tools that have been given to people who can't be on the same page as he is and people like him. Maybe the most famous example of this is the system of temple sacrifices. Maimonides' way of looking at this is an intermediate step in the evolution of a perfect monotheism. But he historicizes it. He says that the Israelites, like other peoples in the ancient Near East, absolutely had to be able to do these things in order to come closer to the service of God. That it's an intermediate step on a holy path. And he would say the same thing about anything else that would appear to compromise what he's laid out meticulously in these first couple of passages. It's a good question.
Did Maimonides identify, well, first of all, you talked about how he said that the master and creator of the universe is replete in and of himself, but did Maimonides address the question of, what was our purpose? What was the purpose of human existence then?
To love God.
To love God.
That's the only purpose of human existence. To know God and to love God. Period. There's no other purpose. And if you give to human existence any other purpose, you are treading water at best. It's the obligation of the believer to keep these things in mind and to constantly be struggling with fending off. We think of temptation, especially on the day after these allegations about the governor of the state of New York. We normally think of the temptations of the body and of carnal pleasures and all of that as the sort of the baseline of temptation. But Maimonides thinks that earthly existence in the body is always fraught with temptations. You have to earn a living, and you have responsibilities to society, all of which are, you must fulfill those. I mean, he's a person in other texts that would appear to us in a completely different light, a very sensitive person, a person caring about his community, about his family, about the future of his people, someone who does not appear to be sort of this guy who's sitting locked in a room contemplating great thoughts and telling everybody else that they have to do it, kind of like a super professor sort of thing, that everybody else except for him is going to flunk this exam. He's not like that in almost any other text that he wrote, or at least a lot of other texts. But the very nature of human existence is one in which we're deflected, he would say, from doing what we are here to do. He wants the audience to take this seriously. He knows that 24/7 is an impossibility, but that's the goal.
If it's a matter of sort of all these linguistic ways of conceptualizing God as sort of intermediate steps, and especially the sort of anthropomorphizing of God, to what extent, I mean, is he seeing the Torah as an intermediate step towards this knowledge? Because
no, it's language. And he's using a Talmudic passage here that I wrote, but in English. The Torah speaks in human language. The Torah uses a language which is accessible to human beings. It's not like this, but what he has done is he's digested it. He's removed the parts of it stylistically or otherwise, and in his mind gotten to the heart of the matter. But he allows, and especially in the ancient world, this is the only way in which people can be taught proper belief, particularly wresting the Israelites from idolatry in the conventional sense, not the sense in which I was talking about it before. That process of weaning a people away from idolatry was itself tortuous. Of course, the Hebrew Bible tells you that on every page, how the Israelites are constantly messing up. So he's well aware of this. But the language, he's using a Talmudic dictum about the language of the Bible and really all of Torah, that it uses human language in order to communicate.
Why does Maimonides believe in Judaism as opposed to...
This is Judaism.
But then what is the necessity of loving of all commandment? Or if you achieve the love of God and the know of God, are all the other commandments necessary?
Yes, they are. And what's the proof? This is a great question, and a lot of people ask this question time and again. You could, particularly in our world, I think, where sort of, we're in an age where there's kind of a theological free-for-all. Anybody can believe in anything they want in any form and call it anything they want. And it's okay, or at least it's okay for them. Most of the time, nobody's going to bother them. Maimonides is not just the articulator of this kind of monotheism devoid of the things that he regards as idolatrous. He then goes on in the rest of the code, which is a multi-volume work, to bother to digest the whole history of rabbinic Judaism into a series of do's and don'ts, and to give explanation for those. He divides the commandments. People didn't like this also, that all of the commandments, in Maimonides' view, have a rational basis, all of them, even the ones that seem not to. They have to, since it's divine revelation, and God is, among other things, pure reason. The commandments have to be rational. They have to have a rational purpose, or they have to be inherently rational. So what are the various purposes of the commandments? They are to order society justly and safely, to look out for the common good, and to lead people on an ethical path. All of the commandments, without exception, even the one that seems the wackiest, like don't mix dairy products with meat products, All of them have a rational basis in the Maimonidean universe. And this is not someone who was simply content to think these great thoughts and say, oh, who needs prayer, who needs observance of 613 commandments, and so on and so forth. This is someone who spent his entire life as a teacher of rabbinic Judaism, as a Jewish educator, as I said, as a local and as an appellate justice, as someone who trained other rabbis, who was kind of the chief judge of Jewish Cairo, if not Egypt at the time, and so forth. So his commitment to that, I think you have to interpret what sounds like language which is taking Jewish theology in a new direction, and of course it is. But he would say no, that he's just stating what is inherently there and making it clearer and more direct and accessible. But in light of the model of the life that he led, as well as his work as a rabbinic scholar, it's very clear that he would regard this, I'm not attributing it to you because a lot of people have said this, but he would regard that as fighting words. But these were objections that were raised about him from the very beginning. Anywhere in Mediterranean Islam, all of those Jewish communities I mentioned, and all of the Jews of Spain and Portugal, these questions, with the exception of the Kabbalists, these questions would not ever occur to them. He is Harav. He is the authority on Jewish law and Jewish thought, period. End of discussion. Not the end of our discussion, unless you want it to be. Maybe you'll take my Maimonides, well, most of you won't be here, but you're welcome to take my Maimonides seminar with Ibn Rushd the next time it comes around in the 3-year cycle. Thanks a lot.